So the last panel, I'm John Echeverria. I'm on the faculty here at Vermont Law School. And we are going to devote the last panel to a discussion of endangered species in a New England context. And demonstrating that we are a flexible institution, and this is a flexible conference, we've actually added a third speaker on the fly who will make a very valuable addition to the program. Our first speaker is Rachel Stevens, who is known to many of you. She is a staff attorney and an assistant professor here at Vermont Law School, working in the Environmental and Natural Resources Clinic. She is a JD and Belt graduate of Vermont Law School. She recently completed a 2-year LLM fellowship program, and as I said, is now working as a staff attorney. She works with the student clinicians on a variety of public interest environmental litigation matters. She's also the chair of the Forestry and Wildlife Committee of the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club. Our second speaker is Jamie Fidel, General Counsel and the Forest and Wildlife Program Director at the Vermont Natural Resources Council. He has a law degree and a master's, like Rachel, from Vermont Law School. At VNRC, he leads the legal program and also the Forest and Wildlife Program. In addition to doing litigation, he advocates in the state legislature on legislative matters relating to forest, wildlife, and land use policy. And finally, making a special guest appearance is Peggy Strusacker, who is a citizen advocate living here in Vermont, working on a variety of wildlife issues. She is going to be speaking about New England wildlife and climate. She brings to this issue a great deal of experience based on work she did primarily out west, working on wolf issues for the National Wildlife Federation for 14 years, and then subsequently working in the Northern Rockies for the Natural Resources Defense Council. So without further ado, we will begin with Rachel.
Hi everyone. So I thought it would be helpful to begin this panel by just getting a sense of what endangered species actually live in New England. Here I've listed the animals that we have listed. We have the Canada lynx, the eastern cougar, the gray wolf, several bat species, the piping plover, bog turtle, the Atlantic salmon. We have a couple of beetle species and mussels. Here are some pictures of those animals for your enjoyment. So in addition to the federally listed species, obviously each state in the state of New England has their own list of species that are protected under the state endangered species law. For instance, here in Vermont, we have about 52 animal species listed, including several more birds and fish species, many bat species, and additionally bumblebees. Each of these species is under natural threats such as predation by other animals, flash floods, cyclical population trends, etc. But these threats have always existed, and it's mostly the man-made threats that are of a real concern to these animals. A couple of the threats, and I think Jamie's going to talk more about these threats later in his presentation, but I just wanted to give you a sense of some of those issues. Obviously, there's habitat loss due to development, logging practices, parcelization and forest fragmentation. There's also the threat of climate change, which we've talked a lot about today. Also the threats from wind energy projects for bird species and bats. And then with fish species, obviously the hydroelectric power issues, which we've also touched on a little bit today. Pollution runoff and into waterways, and then hunting and trapping. So today what I'm going to focus on is a case that we're working on at the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Clinic that has to do with the trapping of Canada lynx in the state of Maine. So I wanted to start, this has been a case that we've had at the clinic since about 2014, and I wanted to know how many students in the audience have actually worked on the lynx case with me. I know we have some people here. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, Corey's up there. So we have several students in the audience that have worked on this case. So it's been a big team effort. So feel free to jump in at the end if you have questions, but I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about what the trapping issues are with Canada lynx. The Canada lynx is a forest-dwelling cat, mostly in northern latitudes. It feeds primarily on snowshoe hares, but will also prey on small mammals and birds. Its range in the contiguous United States extends throughout much of Canada, the boreal forest in the northern United States, the Great Lakes region, the Rocky Mountains, the Cascade Mountains, and in the Northeast it persists primarily in Maine, though lynx have been spotted in Vermont, New Hampshire, and New York. And in fact, I think just as recently as the summer, a few lynx were spotted, or at least one was spotted in June in southern Vermont. The lynx is a medium-sized cat, as you can see. It's similar to the bobcat, but it appears somewhat larger. It has longer hind legs and well-furred paws that make it highly adapted to hunting post-snowshoe hare in the winter climates. There's not a lot of information about the actual population of lynx, but it's estimated to be about 500 species, though it could be less because a lot of that data is based on trapper self-reporting when they actually catch a lynx. So this case arose because Maine authorizes 3 different trapping programs in their state. They have a recreational trapping program, an animal damage control program, and a predator management program. These trapping programs, obviously, the trapping of lynx is prohibited, but they're targeting other species such as bobcat, coyote, bear, fox, beaver, raccoon, marten, fisher, and as you can see, or maybe you might just as kind of common sense, that trapping is kind of inherently an indiscriminate activity. So you could set a trap for a coyote or a bobcat, but a lynx doesn't know the difference and is going to get caught. Some of the traps that I have listed up here on the bottom right-hand corner is what's called a leg hold trap or a foot hold trap, where the animal will, find the bait and kind of walk and push the press pad, and then the jaws will snap around the foot or the leg. There's also a cable restraint or a snare trap, which looks somewhat like a noose, which can catch an animal anywhere on its body, and then it tightens to hold the animal in place. And then on the top is what's called a killer type trap, a body gripping trap, or a conibear trap, which is intended to kill the animal and snap around the head or the neck. So you can imagine, even though the lynx is not a target species, they are regularly caught in these types of traps. Based on the information that we have, in Maine since 1999, it's estimated that about 130 lynx have been captured in traps. We know of about 10 lynx deaths, though there is some debate about whether or not all of the lynx incidents are actually reported, because as I said, most of these are based on trapper self-reporting, or of course if a warden would find an animal trapped in the field. So moving on to the case itself, the case, you can now find it under the heading of Center for Biological Diversity, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It was filed in August of 2015, and we just actually finished a summary judgment briefing, thanks to the students, and it's set for oral argument in about 2 weeks. As Professor Printo explained this morning, under Section 9 of the Endangered Species Act, all takes of endangered and threatened species are prohibited. The term take is broadly defined to include harassment, harm, hunting. It includes trapping, as well as killing or otherwise modifying the habitat. So as you can see, in 2006, the Animal Protection Institute brought an ESA citizen suit against the state of Maine for authorizing trapping programs that was known to capture lynx. And that case resulted in a consent decree that required various restrictions on trapping activities in Maine, and then ultimately led to the state of Maine applying for what's called a habitat conservation plan, or submitting a habitat conservation plan for an incidental take permit, which I'll talk a little bit about. As a result, so that habitat conservation plan was submitted in 2014, open for public notice and comment, and we filed a challenge in August 2015 against the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Because the issuance of an ITP, which is the shorthand name, is an agency decision that's a final administrative action. It's reviewable under the arbitrary and capricious standard of the APA. And our clients in this case are, as listed here, Center for Biological Diversity, the Animal Welfare Institute, and the Wildlife Alliance of Maine. So the type of permit that we're talking about comes under Section 10. In 1982, Congress amended the Endangered Species Act to include some exceptions to the Act's otherwise prohibition on the taking of listed species. It's Section 10A2 that allows the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA to authorize these types of permits. Habitat conservation plans are the planning document, the tool that's a part of an application for an incidental take permit. This HCP, as we also call it, is prepared by the applicant and then in consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and then ultimately approved, if appropriate, by the Fish and Wildlife Service. As of today, I counted, or on the website, 860 habitat conservation plans have been approved in the United States, which covers about 40 million acres of land and involves more than 530 endangered or threatened species. There are 13 habitat conservation plans approved in New England. Several of them are for wind development projects, other just general construction development projects, some on ski resorts, and of course this HCP, which was approved in 2014. So these are the specific, listed here, are the specific requirements that Fish and Wildlife Service must find before they can issue an incidental take permit. Any proposed take must be, quote, incidental to and not the purpose of an otherwise lawful activity. It must not appreciably reduce the likelihood of the survival or recovery of the species in the wild, and it must minimize and mitigate the impact of the take to the maximum extent practicable. So the habitat conservation plan that we are challenging in this case was issued to the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. It anticipates or authorizes the take of 195 lynx over the span of 15 years, that's the permit term. It anticipates that 3 lynx will be killed or otherwise will not be able to be re-released into the wild. 9 lynx will be severely injured and not be able to be recovered. 183 will suffer only minor or no injuries at all. The primary minimization measure required under the permit is trapper education. There's a few other monitoring requirements. Once the permit was issued in 2014, 2 lynx immediately died after the permit became effective. I think it was within 3 weeks of the permit being authorized. So as a result of that, Maine implemented emergency regulations, added an amendment to the plan to require exclusion devices, which are kind of like just a cage on top of the killer type trap. I kind of imagine it as like a smaller grocery cart if you kind of turned it upside down. So that basically has a hole that's supposed to be small, too small for the lynx to enter and reach the trap. As for mitigation, the permit requires maintaining and enhancing 6,200 acres of lynx habitat and is proposed to be funded through annual appropriations by the legislature. Our case claims, and I'd be interested to, because oral argument is coming up, it would be interesting to get some audience feedback, or maybe I'd be happy to talk to anybody at the reception about some of these arguments. But our main claims are that the decision to issue this permit was arbitrary and capricious. One, because it failed to minimize to the extent are practical. There are several practical minimization measures, such as best management practice traps, or B&P traps, which is where you offset the jaw of the trap or pad the trap. Also, trap size restrictions. There's really no explanation in the findings document that coincides with the permit about why those were left out. Additionally, for mitigation, the Fish and Wildlife Service calculated their number of acres based on the 3 lethal takes anticipated in the permit, and we're suggesting that they really should have mitigated for more than that, at least the 9 severely injured, and not just the 3 take. Obviously, the definition of take is broad and is not, the line is not drawn at death, so that's a serious problem in this case. And then finally, for the funding, I think we have the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife has yet to create a forest management plan for this area, so we really have no information about whether or not it will actually be effective and provide some benefit to the species. And so that's kind of the gist of some of the claims that we're making in our briefs. I'm happy to provide those if anybody's interested in reading them. So my last point with my remaining minutes is just to talk a little bit about why this matters. As we've heard this morning, the lynx is really a population in decline. I think it's estimated, let me get the exact figure, that by 2032, about 65% of lynx in its range in Maine it will be reduced by 65% due to forest practices or climate change issues. And at least for this permit, you know, it does set a bad precedent. There are currently several other cases ongoing, HCPs in process in other states where lynx are trapped. This is the first HCP that's ever been issued for trapping related activities, so it's kind of a novel. Usually you have these when you're dealing with a development project, but here we have a trapping activity, so this is kind of some unique issues here. As I said, there's other permits in process in states like Minnesota, Idaho, Montana. They're all dealing with the trapping of lynx issue and what that would mean. So I want to leave that there, and just transition to Jamie. He's going to address some of the challenges about maintaining wildlife in New England and what we can do to kind of protect these species before they're listed.
Great, thanks Rachel. There's no way I'm going to be able to top that last slide that you just put up. So as Rachel outlined, there's 24 species listed in New England, federally listed. And I wanted to provide a little bit of maybe a bigger picture of some of the challenges that we have from a biodiversity conservation perspective. Certainly, recovering and delisting those species are of paramount importance. But there's a bit of a bigger picture which we're struggling with. And so what I did is I combed our state wildlife action plans in New England. So maybe some of you are familiar with the fact that each state does a wildlife action plan now. This is part of a program that was developed back in 2000, and the State Wildlife Grant Program. And it helps the state fish and wildlife agencies and their partners conserve and imperil fish and wildlife species and actually create blueprints or plans that identify species of greatest conservation need and outline the threats to those species and the strategies for addressing those species. And the first round of plans were done in 2005. Now states are revising them in 2015. And as you can see, we have a lot of species that are actually imperiled, trending towards, are in decline and trending towards potential listing. And the whole goal of this program was to try and identify these species and do proactive management so that we wouldn't get to the expensive stage and obviously the contentious stage of then dealing with the species as they're listed. And so here's an outline of the number of species which we're dealing with in the New England context. Some of the states actually added plant species to the plans, even though I don't think they're required to through the statute, but they're obviously taking as proactive approach as possible. And in these plans, I just pulled out what were identified as, the greatest threats. And there's a lot of threats. We know there are like really complex challenges that we have for species, and this is by no means the comprehensive list, but the ones that really do stand out here in the New England context, and probably of no surprise, are housing in urban areas, and that relates to conversion of habitat alteration, fragmentation, parcelization, habitat modification. We have invasive species and disease, huge challenge of climate change, pollution, and there were many other threats identified, but these resonated and were at the top of all the plans in our New England region. I just pulled out just Rhode Island's. Basically every state is ranking their threats, and you can see in Rhode Island huge population density that we're dealing with in a small state. But I wanted to point out at the top and kind of running away with kind of the highest rank is residential and commercial development, and that is, across all the states, pretty much the primary threat, the threat of that's elevated. Interestingly, climate change is actually really starting to make a run at that in some of the plans, and it's just compounding the problem because as we have more and more of our residential, urban, and commercial development happening, we have more and more of a carbon problem. And so we've got, a huge, we've just got a big, huge challenge here that we need to address. So I think this just visually, shows us what we're dealing with here in New England, especially here in Vermont. At Vermont Natural Resources Council, we've been doing a lot of research to try and get a handle on the rates of this, because we know it's happening, but it hasn't even been quantified. And so we're starting to create now the state database to actually identify how much conversion, parcelization is actually happening in the state. And there's actually some really shocking, numbers as you drive through our heavily forested state. I'm often told by people, what's the problem? You've got forests everywhere, and it's really what's going on underneath the forest canopy. And the fact that we have very high rates of parcelization and fragmentation occurring here. And so what does that mean for endangered species or threatened listed species? And so there's been a lot of exciting reference to this lynx that showed up in Vermont, and it's awesome. And here's a picture of it. And there it is in action. But the interesting thing is it was down in southern Vermont. And so lynx, kind of traditionally, has been an outlier species in Vermont, but really important one. There's not a lot of population, there's not a big population in Vermont, but they're up in the Northeast Kingdom, in the Northeast section of Vermont. And this lynx was down in London area, which is in southern Vermont. So, how did it get there? What was it doing? Maybe looking for a snowshoe hare down in southern Vermont. But we've got this issue, right? For a lot of species, there are large home ranges that are required. How are we going to manage these huge home ranges in the context of increasing urban residential development, parcelization, fragmentation that we're seeing throughout New England? So research, this is from Maine. I think probably many of you already know this, but our large forest blocks actually have larger species diversity than the smaller patches or remnant patches. The more they fragment and parcelize our patches, the less species diversity you have. So there is truly a goal that we want to try and maintain these larger tracts if at all possible. Here in Vermont, we've been mapping these. The State Agency of Natural Resources has actually now identified where these forest blocks are, which is very helpful, where the biggest block is up in the Northeast Kingdom, where some of the lynx have been located. And as I said, big blocks have more species diversity, and they need to be connected to remain viable, which, habitat connectivity is clearly and continues to be an emerging scientific area of importance for our overall management and conservation of species. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on connectivity. I think, we all know that this is an important conservation biology principle now that's actually being employed more and more. But again, we've got these really serious trends that we're facing. The Forest Service is documenting that we're losing our forest in our New England region. Here in Vermont, the most recent analysis shows that we may have had a conversion of 75,000 acres of forest land over a 7-year period. I don't think the number is that high. It is within a margin of error, but the general consensus is now we have this huge, amazing conservation forest recovery success story from the heavy clearing 100 years ago, and now for the first time in 100 years, our forests are in decline, and those numbers are similar across New England. And there's projected housing densities that are noticeable in our forests, where we're going to see increased projected rates of development. And just on the right, here's a slide of Vermont before you factor in the roads. And then we could add in the roads, and then we can, the final one didn't come in with the houses, but you begin to see just how highly fragmented Vermont is becoming. I'm not really going to get into this other than there's a lot of studies projecting the land use change that we're going to experience, and it's significant. I think we all know that. We're all witnessing it. Here's one study, urban land projected to increase up to 71%, 2001 to 2051 are baseline conditions. And what I'm just going to highlight from this report, and what I'm finding from a lot of studies, is most people are basically saying that it's going to take extremely aggressive policy intervention to actually change this land use trend, right? And that, even the best land use planning policies are really hard to implement on the ground. And so we just have to kind of brace ourselves almost for the fact that unless we get very aggressive and find a political way to get very aggressive with our land use change policies, we have to brace ourselves for this amount of land use change that's going to just have a really overwhelming impact on species. Okay, so just very quickly, some of the things that are being done in our region, New England, in order to try and address the large-scale kind of curtailment of this overall species decline, and that's starting to really look at the large landscape level conservation that's needed and trying to address identifying priority areas both from a connectivity perspective, from a large intact forest ecosystem perspective, and addressing plans to both identify them and get into action on having priority conservation efforts in those areas. So one initiative is a Staying Connected initiative working throughout New England, northern forest states in Canada to actually identify the most important areas and then really try and both funnel both land conservation efforts, land use planning efforts, transportation, mitigation efforts, and research into those connectivity areas and getting a very concerted effort on identifying them in the region and working on prioritization of those areas. There's been a lot of really excellent scientific work that's going on in order to identify resilient sites for species conservation. Mark Anderson and others have done this work to identify resilient sites in Vermont, which is now funneling into a lot of the science and on-the-ground conservation. We do have federal agencies and partnerships, beyond just the management of the Endangered Species Act. We have scientific efforts to both look at landscape permeability, identifying where are the areas of highest ecological integrity. And Vermont, making a run at its own analysis, which is in some ways similar to what Mark Anderson did, but actually layered in some additional GIS layers. And so this, in a nutshell, it's a very complex methodology that they've employed. But if I can try and maybe dumb it down a little bit, it's essentially identifying where are the highest ranking, most intact blocks, where are there areas of both riparian, aquatic connectivity and terrestrial connectivity, looking at important geological features that add to species richness, and starting to create, from a GIS perspective, the overlays that are needed to identify where the highest priority areas are. And this is just a new design that's come out, and we're hoping that it's going to be influential in both, conservation efforts, where to funnel really limited conservation dollars, where to prioritize land use planning. And on that note, I just wanted to end with a couple of recent successes here in Vermont that give some context to, okay, so what do we do about the land use challenge? And we all know how difficult it is, because even the best land use planning, oftentimes, as we work with communities throughout Vermont, we read a town plan, and there's regional planning commissions, and they have regional plans, and there's really excellent aspirational goals and policies for wildlife conservation. And it ranks really high, among the values that are identified. And then you get into the implementation stage, and you really see where the policies kind of, they don't meet the aspirations. And why is that? I mean, it's tough. You're dealing with private property rights, you're dealing with community members, especially small scale here in Vermont, affecting land uses on our neighbor's land. So how do we get that to translate into the land use policies that will actually conserve the habitat that we need to get conserved? So I'd say after about a 10-year effort in Vermont to raise the profile on the issue of habitat fragmentation, forest fragmentation, there was a really big success story, I think, as far as the conservation community and land use planning community is concerned, in the state agencies, Agency of Natural Resources that helped lead some of these efforts. And the passage of Act 171, it's a very comprehensive forest omnibus bill, but what we were able to do through this bill is actually to add a requirement into the state's land use planning goals to manage Vermont's forest lands so as to maintain and improve forest blocks and habitat connectors. So that's just beyond a goal. it's actually required now for towns to indicate those areas that are important as forest blocks and habitat connectors, and actually to plan for development in those areas to minimize forest fragmentation. And I would add to promote the health, viability, and ecological function of forests. And that's awesome, but how are towns going to do it? So they're going to need assistance. So now they're going to start reaching out. And for those of us that are engaged in the technical assistance, we'll be able to provide them with the templates that have already been developed to do this. So this is getting traction on a really important issue. There's also now a study to look at revision STAC 250, which is our statewide environmental review, development review law, as to whether improvements are needed. And there's a lot of other provisions, but I don't have time to get into it. I do want to mention one other quick success last year, since this last year was so fulfilling and what it can usually be a desert of legislative success. It takes so many years to get these wins. It's just worth standing here at this moment in time, sharing with you a couple of really cool successes here in Vermont. And this one, maybe Professor Perena will remember, but when I took his extinction class back in 2000 for my paper in his class on how are we going to recover species in Vermont, one of the things I researched was the fact that our own state endangered species law didn't have the ability to actually conserve habitat. All it did was to regulate the take of a species, but there was no ability or mechanism to actually designate habitat and prohibit the take of that habitat. And finally, through Act 145, the agency, and I give a lot of credit to our Fish and Wildlife Department for really pursuing this effort and getting it passed. It's not easy to pass this kind of legislation, but there's now authority for our state to actually designate critical habitat for our species, state-listed species, and there's authority to actually write recovery plans and conservation plans for those state-listed species. So now we have to see how the implementation goes. Clearly an important step in the authority. So these are a couple of steps that have been taken, and could be templates, at least on the forest bill, and trying to really get a handle on the land use planning that needs to happen for forests. Perhaps could be something that could be replicated in our other New England states to arrest what is really, our primary threat to species, and that's, the complication of both climate change and its increasing housing, residential parcelization, increasing conversion of our habitat from that rate of development that we're seeing in New England. So with that, I think I'll stop and turn it over.
Now I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be saying.
You'll say fairly quickly, that's all I like.
Fairly quickly. I guess I would like to go into more of the links and also what Jamie was showing on the connectivity with Canada. Because having worked in that northeast on both wolves links, the importance of Canada, you can't even begin to say how important it is. Our lynx population in Maine grew because the Quebec government put a moratorium on trapping lynx years ago. And at that time, everyone said there's no lynx in Maine. We had a wonderful governor there, Governor King, who totally denied lynx were even in Maine. But then they were listed, and so they had to go out and look for them, but they found a small population in the northern area of Maine at Clayton Lake. And since then, we know that through genetics has progressed so much that there is a connectivity between the animals that come out of the Eastern Township and Gaspé Peninsula and into Maine, and those animals have done well enough that we have seen them move into northern New Hampshire. We have had some remnant population in the Mohegan Basin, but the prime core lynx habitat is in north of Route 2 in Maine. And many students may not travel to northern Maine because that is still a really wild area. So I worked on that for years, and also wolf issues, and we know that climate change to me could affect both the populations for if we ever want wolves to come back here. They are going to have to come out of Quebec We know we had animals come in, they've been killed through the 90s and a few in 2000, and they crossed the St. Lawrence River by Tres-Rivières, which is in Quebec, and or the St. Lawrence by Quebec City, which has some island hopping. That used to freeze up solid before they started sticking icebreakers through there. In a couple of years we've had it freeze up solid. In the early 2000s, we did get some dispersing wolves down into our region. If the St. Lawrence stays clear and open and never freezes, it's pretty doubtful that we're going to get any kind of a wolf population, even if they're still protected in the Northeast. But the lynx too depends so much on that heavy snowpack in northern Maine. And with the winter like we had last year, I'm sure the population has tanked a little bit because there just was no snow cover. Even up there, which goes up in quite a bit of an elevation, it's incredible. Lynx are so specific that they need a deep snow cover, and that's why their feet are so huge. And we also have seen predation on lynx kitten by fishers. You probably don't know, but fishers have predated on lynx kittens in our region. And our fisher population booms in our region. But that being said, and fishers, wintertime will really bother them. They're pretty opportunistic little weasels. They climb trees up and down and go after everything. Similar to a wolverine, but a little smaller. So when I was with NWF and going on the incidental take permit, we were told a bunch of time because Maine Fish and Wildlife is pressured by the hunting community to snare coyotes to help increase their deer population. And that's one of the biggest reasons they kept pushing to have this trapping in the region where the lynx are, was because there's this belief, there's no scientific evidence whatsoever, that if we get rid of coyotes, we'll have more deer to hunt. When I was with NWF, I had a wonderful working relationship with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service individuals in the Northeast region here. And whenever we heard that was going to be an inkling coming out of Maine, I just said to Michael Amaral, you don't want litigation on an incidental take permit, do you? And it was put to sleep. Since a number of the major NGOs left the area with who kind of had that little bit of push, things have changed for the animals, and lynx being one. I do think if there was more involvement with more NGOs initially, that incidental take permit wouldn't have gone through. Or if it did, it would have gone through the right way, where they didn't have, one specific kind of trap, pole trap, that caught the two lynx to begin with. Because they were told, and I think Gary Frazier laughed, right? Anyways, they were told that those traps would catch lynx. They had put them in captive areas, set up the traps, and the lynx climbed right up on them and got killed at that point in time. So things like that could totally have been avoided and not have to go to the litigation part of it. And the one thing I can say is, and they did ask in the last, how do you work together? In the smaller states like we've had here, I used to have a great rapport with the state and feds agencies, and it made a huge difference on our work on wolves and lynx. But that's changed, and they're just kind of taking it in the shorts, because the state agencies are not going to do anything to work against the trappers and hunters, and that's what it boils down to. And lastly, that's pretty much what it was.
So picking up on that last point, Rachel, I was curious, who are the trappers? What do they want? And Are your clients dealing with the trappers? Is there common ground? How do they feel about the incidental taking of the lakes? Are they in common cause with you, trying to minimize harm to the endangered species?
So I think the view of the trapsing community in this information I garnered, I went to a public hearing on the emergency rulemaking that happened after the 2 lynx were killed on the leaning pole traps. And a lot of the trappers there testified that, we're catching so many lynx because they're so abundant and they need to be delisted. So much of the testimony that we heard was that, the reason we're catching so many lynx is because there's so many in the state of Maine. And they were really pushing the state of Maine to push the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to try to I'm not exactly sure how the process works, but to do some testing to just show that this animal is kind of genetically distinct and that it has its own robust population, that it's connected with the Canadian population and therefore it's robust and it's not really endangered or threatened in Maine. So at least as far as what I heard at that meeting from trappers, they feel that there's more lynx in the area than people might estimate. The other thing that was interesting is that when the 2 lynx were captured, as you saw from the slide, only 3 lynx can be captured in 15 years under the permit. So it's really interesting because when the permit was being negotiated, trappers wanted the authorization, like the incidental take number, to be as low as possible because the take number sets the foundation for how much minimization, how much mitigation you put in your conservation plan. So they wanted that number to be low. But then after the 2 lynx were taken, there was a lot of testimony at this public hearing about why the take number was so small and, why have we already triggered 2/3 of the breed, why can you put more lynx deaths in your permit? So it's just that was a really interesting dynamic. Having read the record and seen a lot of the testimony on either side, I think it was just an interesting revelation once the 2 were taken, immediately. So that's all about that.
So Jamie, I'm on the member of the Stratford, Vermont Planning Commission. We've read the new legislation and we're trying to figure out how to deal with forest fragmentation and preserve intact habitat. And, I got to tell you, I don't think you'd be really excited about what we've gotten put together so far because we're not putting together policy, prescriptions, and regulations that are going to guarantee success. Oregon has exclusive forestry zoning. They ban development in high priority forest areas. Is that a kind of robust policy solution that might work in Vermont?
Well, there are some Vermont communities that have forest reserve districts that are offer fairly limited options for development. Let's just say hunting camp, that kind of use. Obviously, you need to be careful about taking, but. So I'm aware of Oregon's zoning, and it's an interesting model. Even in Maine, in the unincorporated territory in Maine, which is half of the state, they have worked with the forest products industry actually to support very limited housing and road development in those areas, and it's to maintain the active forest management in the area. But I think that there is where there's support, let's say, for maintaining intact forests, and there's a way to partner with trying to maintain a working landscape, which obviously, making sure that is forest operations and activity are done well. I think there could be support for having some of those more restrictive zones. There are examples throughout Vermont of towns that have actually done it. We have one where I live in Waitsfield, it's a forest reserve district, and it's had water protection, but it actually has very limited development allowed. And that took 3 different attempts at getting it passed. So it's not easy, and I hear kind of what you're saying, that you're not starting out in an ambitious way, but you have to take 3 or 4 runs at it.
Okay, well, I'll raise that. I'm meeting with the chair of the select board tomorrow. One of the questions we've gotten from the audience is, unlike those big square states out west, our states are smaller. And we face regional threats to wildlife. The lynx is a regional species. So the question is whether there's a need for greater interstate cooperation in dealing with wildlife challenges. What are the obstacles to that? What are the opportunities in that area? Thank you for your thoughts.
I think our states actually work pretty well with the lynx because it is species. I do believe we have to start with Canada, Quebec, and that is going to be a tough nut to crack. The lynx and any of our other endangered species that are federally listed, you know, it is the responsibility of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to manage them unless they give the management over to, in a cooperative agreement over to the states. I did see, you know, great work between Maine and New Hampshire, and Vermont just is kind of on the fringe. It's interesting. I don't think trapping, actually the biggest threat to our lynx, if they're in the Mohican Basin, is they allow bear dog training in the spring of the year. And that could be totally disruptive if we have, you know, a mother cat with him. So the state by state really has to work on their own. Awesome.
I know you're all anxious to wrap it up. Are there any burning questions in the audience? Going once, going twice, then I turn it over to the organizers for some final remarks. Please join me in thanking our final.
Again, thank you all for speaking on this panel. You might have heard, so Rachel's been working on this case for a very long time. Our oral argument is November 3rd in Bangor, Maine, and because we adopted the lynx on behalf of the New England panel, this entire symposium, I would like to bestow upon Rachel the coveted Good Luck Lynx. Thank you, Rachel, for all of your hard work. Good luck on November 3rd.
Yes, we'd like to thank everybody for coming and for staying through. It's been fantastic. I'm really proud of the VJEL staff for putting this together. And my compatriot Elizabeth, it's been fantastic working with her. I'd like to especially thank Professor Echevarria for being our faculty advisor and helping us contact speakers, along with Professor Parento and Dean Mears. It's been wonderful to work with them. I think this issue is fascinating. I think there's a lot of good work to be done, a lot of good work that's happening. I'm glad to hear about it, and yeah, thank you so much.
So I don't know if you guys noticed, but the Endangered Species Act is near and dear to my heart. And I am delighted to look around the room at all of you and see I'm not alone. It seems like all of you have this burning passion for endangered species, so thank you for bringing that passion here to the symposium. Max and I have been working on this since February. I actually didn't have a running mate when I was running for symposium editor, and Max volunteered to be my human. Through all of my eccentricities, Max has made sure that this symposium was going to go really, really well. So I just want to give another hand for Max for making sure this went so well. I also want to thank absolutely everyone in this room, especially faculty like Pat and Professor Echevarria, because without you, it would have been extremely difficult to organize something this big with such amazing speakers. And I want to thank all of our guests for being so interested in the Endangered Species Act. I'm surrounded by faculty members and mentors who tell me that the previous generation failed the current generation in preserving the environment. Well, as Gary Fraser and Pat and many others have said, it's up to the current generation to pick up where the previous one failed. So I'm looking around at all these VLS students, and we're the next generation. So whether you're fresh out of undergrad, like I was a couple years ago, whether you have a couple of years of career experience under your belts before you came here, or whether law school was kind of the semi-daunting, maybe crazy decision to just come to law school, pick up your entire career, and move it here, you're part of this next generation. So wherever you go, I hope every one of you in this room takes the knowledge that you gained today into your positions as lawyers, leaders, politicians, political appointees, judges, And maybe one of us is going to end up in the Oval Office someday. So I hope you take what you learned here out into the world with you and protect all species. Thank you guys.